But you can't now. You can't because the government has said you can't pay less than W lower bar. So you end up with excess supply. You end up, and we call that excess supply unemployment. You end up with unemployment because at that high wage, firms are not willing to hire as many workers as willing to work. And you end up in disequilibrium. You end up not in equilibrium, but disequilibrium. Now, disequilibrium is kind of hard to think about because in some sense, this course is all about equilibrium. So I'm not talking about chaos or cats and dogs living together, breakdown of social order. That's not what I'm talking about. Okay? Disequilibrium, okay, there is still a market outcome. There is still, the market still settles at a point. In this case, what happens is the market settles at a wage of W lower bar, because it has to, and at an amount of labor delivered at L sub S, that low amount of labor delivered. Because when you're in disequilibrium, okay, the outcome of quantity and prices is determined by the constrained party. That's the way I like to think about it. You can think about it whatever you want, but here's the point. Workers can't work if firms won't hire them. So if you want to say, look, we're going to end up at W lower bar, how much labor is going to be in the market? Well, it's up to the firms, right? They get to decide. They're going to say, look, we don't want more than L sub D, so that's how many jobs they're going to provide. And so the new outcome is going to be at a wage W lower bar and an amount of hours L sub D. Okay? So basically, you end up with this unemployment situation where only L sub D workers are hired and the wage is W lower bar. Okay? Now, let me ask a question. What would happen if W sub lower bar was set below W star? What if I'd redrawn this diagram so W lower bar was below W star? Yeah?
The market would equilibrate at E.
Yeah, nothing would happen at the end of the day. And here's the key point, very important point to remember, which is that markets are very robust. Economic markets are very robust. And if they can undo the effect of government intervention, they will. So if the government tries to come and intervene in a way which markets can undo and get back to where they wanted to be, they will. That original point E is where the market wants to be. That was where it was happy. It can't get there in the example I taught here with W lower bar above W star. But if W lower bar was below W star, it could get there and be happy. So government intervention would make no difference. Okay? That's one example of a government intervention. Let's do another example, and then I want to talk about the pros and cons of these government interventions. Let's do another example. Gas price ceilings. Okay? Gas price ceilings. Okay? So let's consider a cap on how much can be charged for gas. Seems pretty sensible policy. Gas is crazy expensive. We all like to drive. So let's consider a cap on the price of gas. Imagine, for example, we're initially in equilibrium in figure 2.6 with a demand of Q2 and a price of P1. We're all happy. Okay? Now let's imagine there's an oil crisis. Gas, because let's say oil companies decide it's a good idea to drill 8 miles underground and everything explodes and we're suddenly running out of oil. Okay? So suddenly, all of a sudden, there's a constraint in the supply. Suddenly, there's a I'm sorry, my bad. We're initially in equilibrium at E1. My bad. We're initially at equilibrium at E1 with a price of P, okay, with a price of P1. There's a bit of mislabeling here. On the vertical axis, that upper price should be P2. So on the vertical axis, you see there's P1 equals P. Then above it, it says P1 again. That should say P2. So we're initially in equilibrium at point E1 with a price of P1 and a quantity of Q1. Now, oil tanks blow up all over the world. Suddenly that means there's a restriction in the supply of gas. Suddenly there's not as much gas as can be produced. So that's an upward shift in the supply curve, just like we talked about before. And absent any government intervention, the supply curve would shift up to S2. Consumers would want less gas, and you'd reach a new equilibrium at E2. And once again, I talk about equilibrium as being where people are happy. Now you can say, well, gee, people aren't happy paying a higher price for gas. Well, that's why I'm a bit glib using the term happy. It's a point where the suppliers and demanders are jointly willing to make the deal. Okay? And they're willing to make the deal at E2. They're willing to say, look, given how many oil rigs have blown up, we're happy to equilibrate the market now at a higher price and a lower quantity. But then, it's September 2010, there's an election 2 months away. President Obama isn't very happy about this. Okay, he says, forget it. We're going to cap the price at P. We were paying P before, we can pay P again. Those stupid oil companies can suck it up. They're the ones who drilled 8 miles underground. They're the ones who blew everything up. They can suck it up. We're keeping the price at P. We'll help the consumer. Okay, we'll keep the price. Well, what happens? What happens is that consumers are now great. We continue to want Q1. That's where before we were happy. Okay, but producers say, well, you know what, President, we can't supply that much at that price because it costs us so much to drill oil now. Okay, that if you're going to force us to keep the price at P1, we're only going to supply Q sub D. Because we just can't supply at that low price. We're going to supply Q sub D. So what happens, you end up with excess demand. Consumers want Q sub D gallons. Producers are going to willing to produce only Q sub S. And you end up with disequilibrium. And in this case, once again, the amount sold is what the producers are willing to sell. It doesn't matter how much consumers want if producers aren't willing to sell it. You end up with disequilibrium, and you end up with much, much less gas being sold. Okay? So yeah, the price stays low, but the amount of gas being sold is much lower than if the president allowed the price to rise. Okay? So that's another example of a government intervention causing disequilibrium. Okay, so now, any questions about that? Yeah?
In the last example you talked about, can't the government come in and give a subsidy to the oil producers to produce like the same amount?
Great, great. Hold that thought for 1441, but that's exactly what the government could do. The government has lots of tools. So it could come in and say, well, on the one hand, we set a price cap, but then we'll come in on the other hand and give a subsidy to oil producers to make sure they do that. That has two problems. One is not so good with the voters. Like, gee, we're going to give subsidies to oil companies. Isn't that a great idea? Okay. Two is you got to raise the money somehow, which means you got to raise taxes. Also not so good with the voters. So it's, in general, not a good idea because you've screwed up on the one hand to screw up again. Because it's, two wrongs don't make a right, something you learn from an early age. If the government's messed up the market on the one hand, it's not generally a good idea to try to mess with it again to fix that. But that's exactly the kind of stuff we'll discuss in 1441. Yeah. Great segue to what I want to talk about next, which is what are the costs and benefits of these kinds of market interventions, of a minimum wage or a gas price ceiling? Why do we do this? I mean, the government, these aren't stupid people by and large. Okay? Why do governments do things like this? What are the costs and benefits? Okay? Now, later this semester, we'll talk about welfare economics. By welfare has two meanings. We start to think of welfare as being money you distribute to poor people. That's one meaning. But when we say welfare in economics, we actually mean well-being, the well-being of society. And we'll talk about the well-being of society later on in the semester. But let's talk for a minute about this general topic and how do we think about the kind of welfare economics of these restrictions. Well, there's two costs and one benefit to these restrictions. Okay? The first cost is the efficiency loss. Okay, so the costs of things like the minimum wage and gas price ceilings, the first cost is the efficiency loss. And we are going to be much more precise. This lecture is sort of a chance to be loosey-goosey about things that I'll then make much more precise throughout the semester. We're more precise about what we mean by this throughout the semester. But the key point is, in economics, whenever there is a trade that can be made that makes both parties better off, and it is not made, that is an inefficiency. So in economics, we define efficient as when all trades that could make both parties better off are made. And wherever anything comes up that interferes, so a trade that could make both parties better off is not made, that is inefficient. There's an efficiency loss. And think about it, it makes sense. If both parties can